Case 1. Shanynthia Gardner. The 19th of June, 2016. Shelby County Criminal Court, Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis rises from the bluffs above the Mississippi River in the far southwestern corner of Tennessee. A city of enormous cultural significance, the birthplace of the blues, the city where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. drew his last breath, a place of music and complexity and history that runs so deep it has a physical weight. Memphis is a city that has known hardship. It has known violence. Its residents carry the accumulated experience of a community that has been tested by poverty, by crime, by the full spectrum of urban challenge, and has, time and again, found within itself the resilience to carry on. But even a city accustomed to hard things can be stopped cold. On the 19th of June, 2016, a Sunday, Father's Day, the temperature in Memphis was climbing towards summer's full intensity when emergency dispatchers received a call that would become one of the most devastating in the city's recent history. Officers were sent racing toward a residence on Harvest Hill Drive, in a neighborhood in the northern part of the city. The initial call reported a disturbance. What awaited them was something far beyond the ordinary scope of what those words suggest. Inside the home, 4 children lay dead. Not 1, not 2. 4 children, ranging in age from 10 years old to just 1 year old. All belonging to a single mother. All killed, it would emerge, within the same terrible window of time on that Sunday afternoon. Their names were Sia Gardner, aged 10. Sylvester Gardner, aged 7. Sutton Gardner, aged 4. And Sierra Gardner, just 1 year old. A baby who had been alive long enough to learn some faces, to smile, to be held, and then to be gone. All 4 had been stabbed to death. The woman found at the scene, the children's mother, was 33-year-old Shanynthia Gardner. Officers took her into custody. The house on Harvest Hill Drive became, in the language of law enforcement, a crime scene, a space to be documented, photographed, analyzed, and processed with the exhaustive thoroughness that 4 deaths demanded. What investigators found as they began their work told a story that required them to understand not just what had happened on that Sunday, but the weeks and months that led up to it. The picture that emerged was one of a woman under enormous strain. Shanynthia Gardner was raising 4 daughters largely on her own. She was navigating the end of a difficult relationship. By accounts from those who knew her, she had been showing signs of serious psychological distress in the period before the killings, signs that, in hindsight, those around her recognized as indicators of a mental state that had been deteriorating in ways that nobody had adequately addressed. Those around her. That phrase carries weight. Because one of the most agonizing aspects of cases like this one, cases where the evidence suggests mental illness played a significant role, is the question of who saw what, and when, and what they did with what they saw. Neighbors, family members, friends, people who had perhaps noticed something off, something worrying, something that in retrospect reads as a warning sign that went unheeded. That question would eventually make its way into the courtroom, where Shanynthia Gardner's defense attorneys mounted an argument centered on her mental state. They argued that their client had been suffering from severe mental illness, a condition so profound and so untreated that on the day she killed her 4 daughters, she was not operating within the boundaries of rational consciousness. That she was, in the legal sense, not criminally responsible for what she had done. The prosecution argued otherwise. They acknowledged the presence of mental illness as a factor in the case, but they argued that the 4 deaths were not the product of a single, uncontrolled moment of psychotic break. They were individual acts. For separate children, each one killed, each death a distinct event within a broader sequence of violence. That sequence, prosecutors argued, reflected a level of deliberateness that the law was required to address. The mental competency proceedings that preceded the actual trial were lengthy and complicated. Gardner was evaluated multiple times by mental health professionals. The question of whether she was competent to stand trial, whether she understood the charges against her and could assist in her own defense, was examined, debated, and ultimately resolved in a way that allowed the case to proceed. The trial itself was one of the most emotionally charged in Shelby County's recent memory. Jurors were asked to consider not only the physical evidence of what had happened in that home, the forensic details, the timeline, the manner of each child's death, but also the complex interplay between mental illness and legal culpability that the defense had placed at the center of its argument. Memphis watched the proceedings with a kind of collective held breath. The city had known tragedy. It had mourned public figures and private citizens alike. But the death of 4 children, 4 sisters, the youngest of them still a baby, touched something in the community that went beyond the ordinary parameters of civic grief. Shanynthia Gardner was convicted on all counts. For counts of first-degree murder. The jury, after deliberation, determined that the legal standard for conviction had been met, that the evidence supported a finding of guilt despite the mental health arguments offered in her defense. At sentencing, the weight of what had occurred was impossible to fully articulate. A judge can speak words. A sentence can be pronounced. Numbers can be assigned to years. Or, in a case of this magnitude, life itself can be assigned as the unit of measure. But no sentence restores Saya to her 10-year-old self, reading books and navigating the social complexity of elementary school. No sentence gives Sylvester back her 7-year-old certainty that the world is knowable and manageable. No sentence returns Sutton to the 4-year-old's irrepressible curiosity about everything. And no sentence gives Sierra, 1-year-old, barely arrived, the chance to become whoever she was going to be. Shanynthia Gardner received 4 consecutive life sentences. She will spend the remainder of her days in a Tennessee correctional facility. Memphis buried for little girls. The neighborhood on Harvest Hill Drive continued its ordinary business of existence, as neighborhoods must, because life does not pause for grief, however justified. But the city carried the knowledge forward. The knowledge that on a Father's Day Sunday, 4 daughters lost their lives in a house on a Memphis street, at the hands of the only person who should have been absolutely certain to keep them safe. The voices of Saya, Sylvester, Sutton, and Sierra Gardner are silent. They will always be silent. But in case files and in courtroom records and in the collective memory of a city that does not easily forget, they remain. If the names of these 4 sisters stayed with you, if this case stirred something that demands a response, give this documentary a like and leave a comment below. Tell us their names. Say them out loud. Your engagement keeps these stories alive and ensures that Saya, Sylvester, Sutton, and Sierra are never forgotten. And please, don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Silent Files so you never miss a case. These children deserve witnesses. Case 2. Lindsay Lowe. The 2nd of October, 2010. Sumner County Criminal Court, Hendersonville, Tennessee. Northeast of Nashville, where the Cumberland River curves through a landscape of residential development and suburban infrastructure, lies Hendersonville, a city in Sumner County that has grown steadily in the orbit of Tennessee's capital. It is a community of churches and schools, of neighborhoods where families put down roots and children grow up knowing their neighbors, of a social fabric woven from the traditions of Middle Tennessee life. It is the kind of place where the concept of community still carries genuine weight, where people show up for each other, where faith and family are the organizing principles of daily existence. It is also the place where, on the 2nd of October, 2010, a 25-year-old woman named Lindsay Lowe gave birth to twin baby boys in a bathroom, alone, in the middle of the night, and where both of those babies were dead before morning came. The story of Lindsay Lowe is, in many ways, a story about secrets, about the extraordinary and terrible lengths that human beings will go to in order to avoid a confrontation they fear, about the way that shame, culturally enforced, religiously amplified, socially devastating in its consequences, can drive a person to choices that are, by any measure, catastrophic. Lindsay Lowe had been pregnant for 9 months. 9 months is not a short time. It is an entire season of basketball, an entire agricultural cycle, 3/4 of a calendar year. Over the course of those 9 months, the human body undergoes changes that are, in most circumstances, visible, unmistakable, and impossible to entirely conceal. And yet Lowe managed it, or managed it well enough that the people in her immediate environment, including the parents with whom she lived, did not know. How? Those who examine the case point to a combination of factors. Lowe wore loose clothing. She managed her social interactions carefully. She avoided situations where her body would be scrutinized. And she maintained, through some combination of will and desperation, a daily performance of normalcy that kept the secret intact for the entire duration of the pregnancy. Why? Because Lindsay Lowe was terrified of what the revelation would mean. She came from a deeply religious household, a family where faith was not incidental but central, where the moral framework was clear and strict, where an unmarried pregnancy carried implications that extended far beyond personal disappointment into the realm of spiritual failure, family shame, and social consequence. Lowe reportedly believed that if her parents discovered she was pregnant, the fallout would be devastating and irreversible. And so she said nothing, did nothing, made no prenatal appointments, saw no doctors, made no plans for what would happen when the time came. The time came on the night of October 2nd. Alone in a bathroom in the family home on a quiet street in Hendersonville, Lindsay Lowe went into labor. She gave birth without assistance, without medical care, without so much as a single person in the house who knew what was happening behind that closed door. And she did not give birth once. She gave birth twice. Twin boys, emerging into the world in the dark and the silence, with nobody present but their mother. Both were alive. What happened in the minutes and hours that followed is the subject of what became one of the most wrenching criminal trials in Sumner County history. According to the prosecution's account, supported by forensic evidence, by the physical condition of the infants' bodies, and by the investigation conducted by law enforcement, Lindsay Lowe made a deliberate choice, repeated twice, to end the lives of her newborn sons. She covered their mouths and noses. She held them until they stopped breathing. First one boy, then the other. Then she wrapped their small bodies, placed them in a laundry basket, covered it, and, in the most chilling detail of the entire account, returned to her ordinary existence. Went back to living in the house. Went back to appearing, from the outside, as though nothing had happened. The bodies were discovered the following day. The discovery was not made by a stranger or by a random passerby. It was made in the home where the family lived, a home where, for the entirety of the night, 2 newborn boys had been lying dead in a laundry basket while their grandparents slept in nearby rooms, unknowing. Law enforcement moved quickly. Lowe was identified as the mother within hours. Forensic examination confirmed she had given birth very recently. The condition of the infants, the specific physical evidence of how they had died, told investigators what had happened. Lowe was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Her trial became a focal point not just for Sumner County, but for discussions across Tennessee and beyond about neonaticide, the killing of newborns, and about the complex intersection of mental state, religious and cultural pressure, and criminal responsibility that such cases inevitably raise. Defense attorneys argued that Lowe's psychological state in the moments after giving birth, alone, terrified, overwhelmed, having just delivered twins without any preparation or support, constituted a kind of desperate panic that the law should weigh against the charge of deliberate murder. Prosecutors countered that whatever Lowe's emotional state, she had made sequential, deliberate choices. She had not acted in a single uncontrolled moment. She had killed one child, and then she had killed the second child, and then she had concealed both deaths and gone about her life. The sequence, they argued, was evidence of intent. The jury convicted her on both counts. 2 life sentences were handed down. But the case did not conclude at sentencing. Lindsay Lowe's legal journey continued through the appellate courts, and at one point, her conviction was overturned by the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals, which identified reversible errors in the original proceedings related to jury selection and the instructions given to the jury. For a period, it appeared that Lowe might face a new trial. The Tennessee Supreme Court reviewed the case and ultimately reinstated the conviction. The appeals process had run its course. Lindsay Lowe's fate was sealed. She would spend her life in a Tennessee prison. Hendersonville absorbed this case the way communities absorb difficult truths, slowly, imperfectly, with a lingering unease that does not entirely resolve. Because the questions it raises are not comfortable ones. Is a culture that attaches so much shame to unmarried pregnancy part of the chain of causation that leads to a bathroom and 2 dead babies in a laundry basket? Can a community be, in some diffuse and complicated way, implicated in the desperate choices made by individuals crushed under the weight of its expectations? Those are not questions that admit of easy answers. They are not questions that absolve Lindsay Lowe of her criminal responsibility for the deaths of 2 living human beings. But they are questions that a society serious about preventing tragedies like this one cannot afford to avoid. The twin boys born on the 2nd of October, 2010, were never named in public record. They were referenced in court documents as baby boy Lowe, both of them, sharing even that anonymous designation as they had shared everything else. They lived for minutes. They were held, if they were held at all, by the one person in the world who should have been their first and most certain protector. They are not forgotten. Not here. Those two boys deserved names, and they deserved a chance at life. If this case stayed with you, leave a like, leave a comment, say something. Your voice is a form of witness. And don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Silent Files, because every victim, named or unnamed, deserves to be remembered. Case 3. Cheyenne Dawn Maddox. Discovered the 27th of January, 2019. Montgomery County Criminal Court, Clarksville, Tennessee. Clarksville, Tennessee sits in Montgomery County in the northern reaches of Middle Tennessee, pressed up against the Kentucky state line and anchored in large part by the presence of Fort Campbell, one of the largest military installations in the United States, home to the storied 101st Airborne Division and a military community that brings tens of thousands of soldiers, families, and support personnel into the orbit of a mid-sized Tennessee city. Clarksville has grown dramatically in recent decades, expanding outward from its historic downtown along the Cumberland River into a sprawl of subdivisions, commercial corridors, and the institutional infrastructure of a community that serves both a civilian and a military population. It is a city shaped, in meaningful ways, by the values and structures of the military. Discipline, accountability, toughness, the idea that you show up, you do your job, you take care of your people. Those values permeate the culture of the city and extend, in various ways, into the civilian communities that surround the base. And yet, within that community, in a home in Clarksville, Tennessee, a teenage boy was starving. Not quickly, not invisibly, but slowly, over what investigators would determine had been a prolonged period. His body was being deprived of the nutrition it needed to sustain itself. He was wasting away, and the person responsible for feeding him, for keeping him alive, for meeting the most fundamental obligation that any parent owes any child, was his mother. Her name was Cheyenne Dawn Maddox. The discovery of the boy's condition, and ultimately of his death, came to official attention on the 27th of January, 2019. The details that emerged as investigators began their work were devastating in their specificity. Starvation leaves a record in the body that medical examiners can read with precision. It is documented in the organs, in the muscle tissue, in the bones, in every system that the body progressively cannibalizes in its desperate attempt to keep the heart beating when no external source of nutrition is provided. The findings in this case told a story of deprivation that had not lasted days, but had extended over a far longer period, long enough that the damage to the teenager's body was profound and, ultimately, irreversible. How does a teenager starve to death? The question seems almost impossible to formulate in a modern American context, a country where food banks and school lunch programs and community organizations exist precisely because society has decided, at least in principle, that no child should go hungry. A teenager is old enough to communicate hunger, old enough to ask for food, to seek it out, to make their condition known to someone outside the home. But teenagers in abusive or neglectful households are also, paradoxically, among the most invisible victims. They are old enough that the outside world assumes their needs are being met. They are young enough that they lack the full autonomy to seek help independently. They are caught in a space between the hypervisibility of very young children, whose welfare tends to attract more immediate community concern, and the self-sufficiency of adults who can, at least in theory, provide for themselves. And in homes where neglect is severe enough to be life-threatening, the isolation of the victim from outside contact is often part of the pattern. School absences that go unaddressed, social connections that are severed or never formed, an existence so contained within the walls of a single home that the outside world has no window into what is happening. Those dynamics were part of what investigators examined in the Maddox case. The investigation involved a review of records, school records, medical records, Child Protective Services contact history, that assembled a timeline of the teenager's deterioration and of the institutional knowledge, or lack thereof, that surrounded it. Cheyenne Dawn Maddox was charged with reckless homicide and aggravated child neglect. The charges represented the prosecution's legal framing of what they believed the evidence showed, not a sudden act of violence, but a sustained and criminal failure of care, a mother who had allowed, or actively caused, her child to reach a state of starvation incompatible with life. The case proceeded through Montgomery County Criminal Court. The prosecution presented its evidence, the medical findings, the forensic documentation of the teenager's condition, the timeline of his deterioration, the testimony of witnesses who had knowledge of the household. The defense offered its response. Maddox was convicted. The conviction was the court's formal acknowledgement that a teenage boy in Clarksville, Tennessee, had died of starvation while in his mother's care, and that under Tennessee law, that death constituted both reckless homicide and aggravated child neglect, warranting criminal punishment. The sentence handed down reflected the court's assessment of the severity of what had occurred. A child had died in one of the most drawn-out, painful ways a human being can die, not in a moment, not in an instant, but over a period of time during which his suffering was ongoing and his dependence on the adults around him absolute. The community of Clarksville, Fort Campbell's civilian neighbor, a city shaped by the ethos of showing up and taking care of your people, was confronted with a case that challenged those values in the most direct possible way. A boy in their community had not been taken care of, had been, in the most fundamental sense, abandoned by the person most responsible for his survival, not in a dramatic, visible way, but in the quiet, accumulating way that neglect operates, day by day and meal by meal, until the body finally gives out. The question of what more could have been done, by schools, by neighbors, by family members, by every institution and individual that might have intersected with this teenager's life before January of 2019, is one that Montgomery County must carry forward. Not as a source of collective guilt, but as a source of collective motivation. Because the next teenager in a home like that one deserves a different outcome. And the teenager at the center of this case deserved one too. Neglect is silent violence. If this story moved you, please like this video, drop a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Silent Files, because awareness, in cases like this one, can literally save lives. Case 4. Megan Boswell. The 6th of February, 2021. Sullivan County Criminal Court, Blountville, Tennessee. The northeastern corner of Tennessee is a world apart from the rest of the state. Here, the Appalachian Mountains press in from every direction, defining not just the landscape, but the culture. A region of deep-rooted communities, of family names that have occupied the same hollers and ridgelines for generations, of a distinctly Appalachian identity that is proud, resilient, and not easily given to the kind of transient anonymity that characterizes more urban parts of the country. Sullivan County sits in this corner of Tennessee, pressed against the Virginia state line, its county seat at Blountville, and its two largest cities being Kingsport and Bristol, the latter of which is split directly down the middle by the state line, a city that belongs simultaneously to Tennessee and Virginia. It is a region with a manufacturing heritage, with a strong Appalachian cultural identity, and with the kind of close community ties that mean, when something goes wrong, word travels fast. Word traveled fast in January of 2021. The subject of that word was a 15-month-old girl named Evelyn Mae Boswell. And the reason the word was traveling was that Evelyn was missing. Evelyn Mae Boswell was, by all accounts of those who had known her, a bright and lively toddler, the kind of 15-month-old who is beginning to discover the full scope of what her body and her world can do. At 15 months, children are typically just finding their feet, literally and figuratively, beginning to walk, beginning to string sounds into approximations of words, beginning the explosive phase of curiosity and exploration that defines toddlerhood. They are exhausting and delightful in equal measure, and they are, in every moment, entirely dependent on the adults around them for safety, for food, for the basic architecture of their daily lives. Evelyn's mother was Megan Boswell, who was 21 years old. According to Megan Boswell's initial account to investigators, Evelyn had last been seen in December of 2020, weeks before the case first came to public and law enforcement attention. The delay between Evelyn's last known presence and the point at which her absence was formally reported was, from the very beginning, a source of serious investigative concern. The explanation provided for that delay shifted. The accounts Megan Boswell gave to law enforcement changed. Details that were provided in one conversation did not align with details provided in another. Investigators experienced in the dynamics of missing children cases recognized the pattern of a story that was being constructed and reconstructed, not a story being told, but a story being built. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation became involved. Sullivan County law enforcement coordinated with state resources. The case attracted media coverage that extended well beyond the region. Evelyn's face, round-cheeked and bright-eyed in the photographs that circulated across social media and news coverage, became one of the most recognized images in Tennessee in the early weeks of 2021. Volunteers organized searches. Hundreds of people who had never met Evelyn May Boswell walked fields and woods in the cold of a Tennessee winter, calling a name and hoping for a response that never came. They walked in the kind of grim, determined hope that community members summon when a child is missing, a hope that coexists with a dread that grows harder to push back as days turn into weeks. On the 6th of February, 2021, the dread was confirmed. Evelyn May Boswell's remains were found on a property in Sullivan County. She had been dead for a significant period of time. The discovery ended the search, but did not end the grief. It transformed it, sharpening it from the anguish of uncertainty into the harder, colder grief of knowing. Megan Boswell was arrested. She was charged with first-degree murder in the death of her 15-month-old daughter. The investigation that followed the discovery of Evelyn's remains was thorough and multifaceted. It involved forensic analysis of the scene where her body was found, digital forensics, phone records, social media activity, electronic communications that painted a picture of what Boswell had been doing and saying in the weeks between Evelyn's death and the discovery of her remains, and the testimony of witnesses who had knowledge of the household, of Boswell's behavior, and of the circumstances surrounding Evelyn's disappearance from public view. What emerged from that investigation was a portrait of deliberate concealment, not the panicked, reactive concealment of someone who had done something terrible in a moment and then frozen, but the more sustained concealment of someone who had made choices, over a period of weeks, to manage information, manage appearances, and manage the people around her in ways that kept the truth hidden. The media interviews that Megan Boswell had given during the search period, the public appeals, the statements about wanting to find her daughter, were, in the context of what investigators were building, among the most disturbing elements of the case. The gap between public presentation and private reality, when the full picture came into view, was vast. The trial of Megan Boswell was conducted in Sullivan County Criminal Court and was one of the most closely watched proceedings in the region in years. The prosecution presented its case methodically and thoroughly. The forensic evidence, the digital evidence, the testimony of witnesses, the timeline that investigators had assembled from the evidence available. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty. Megan Boswell was convicted of first-degree murder. At sentencing, the court heard from people who had known Evelyn, who could speak to who she was in the brief 15 months of her life. A 15-month-old has a personality, has preferences, has the beginning of a character that, given time, would have developed into the full complexity of a human individual. Those who knew Evelyn spoke of those early signs of who she was. The judge spoke of the weight of taking a child's life and then concealing it while a community searched. Megan Boswell received a sentence of life in prison. Sullivan County did not forget Evelyn May Boswell. In the months and years that followed, her name remained present in the community's consciousness, in the conversations that parents and neighbors and community leaders had about child welfare, about warning signs, about the systems that exist to protect children and the gaps in those systems where children can fall. Murals and memorials reflected the community's determination to keep Evelyn's memory alive. She was 15 months old. She was just learning to walk in a world that should have been safe for her to explore. For Evelyn, please leave a like, leave a comment with her name, and share her story. Let the whole world know she existed and that she mattered. Don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Every subscription is a way of standing up for the children who couldn't stand up for themselves. Case 5. Jalani Patton. The 15th of August, 2022. Rutherford County Criminal Court, Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Drive southeast from Nashville for roughly 30 miles along Interstate 24, and you will arrive in Murfreesboro, the seat of Rutherford County and, by some measures, one of the fastest-growing cities in the United States. Over the past 2 decades, Murfreesboro has transformed from a mid-sized Middle Tennessee city into a sprawling urban center absorbing the overflow of Nashville's extraordinary growth, its population expanding year after year as new subdivisions press outward into farmland that, not long ago, was quiet and rural. Middle Tennessee State University anchors the city's identity as a place of education and intellectual life. Medical facilities, commercial development, and a diverse and growing residential population have given Murfreesboro a vitality and an energy that is palpable. It is a city in the process of becoming, always expanding, always building, always welcoming new families who have come seeking the combination of Southern character and urban opportunity that the Nashville metro area provides. Families, children, new beginnings. On the 15th of August, 2022, a mother in Murfreesboro called emergency services to report that her infant was not breathing. The call itself is not unusual in the grim statistical landscape of infant emergencies. Babies are fragile. The terrifying middle-of-the-night emergency in which a parent discovers that something is wrong with a sleeping infant is a real and documented experience, one that emergency services across the country respond to regularly. Responders are trained to arrive quickly, to work with everything they have, and to bring the resources of modern emergency medicine to bear on a situation where minutes matter. When paramedics arrived at the home of Jalani Patton in Murfreesboro on that August morning, they found an infant in critical condition. They worked. The baby could not be saved. The infant was dead. The response that follows the death of an infant in circumstances like these is, and must be, a careful and thorough one. Emergency medical personnel, law enforcement, and eventually forensic specialists all become part of a process designed to answer the question that every infant death demands. Why? What happened to this baby? In many cases, the answer is the hardest kind. The kind that offers no one to blame, because the cause is medical, or because it falls into the category of sudden infant death, that devastating and still incompletely understood phenomenon in which an apparently healthy baby simply stops breathing. Those cases are tragedies. They are not crimes. But investigators are trained to look carefully, to examine the totality of the circumstances, to consider whether the physical evidence of the infant's condition, the details of the environment, and the account provided by the caregiver are consistent with each other. And in the case of Jalani Patton's infant, the examination that followed raised concerns serious enough to be brought before a grand jury. Jalani Patton was indicted on charges of first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. The gravity of those charges demands a moment of careful consideration. First-degree murder, in Tennessee, as in virtually every American jurisdiction, requires the element of premeditation. It is the most serious criminal charge the law provides. When a grand jury returns an indictment on that charge in connection with an infant's death, it reflects a finding that the evidence, as presented to them, supports the conclusion that what happened to that baby was not accident, not medical tragedy, but deliberate, intentional killing. Aggravated child abuse, as a companion charge, indicates that investigators also believe the infant had been subjected to serious abuse significant enough in its nature and consequence to warrant the most severe version of the charge under Tennessee law. The case against Jalani Patton was moving through the Rutherford County court system at the time of this documentary's preparation. She carries, under the law, the presumption of innocence until and unless a jury determines otherwise. The legal process is ongoing, and its outcome will be determined by the evidence presented in court. But the baby at the center of this case cannot wait for legal processes. The baby is gone. A life that was just beginning, a few weeks, perhaps a few months, of existence in a world that was entirely new and entirely dependent on adult care, was extinguished. Murfreesboro is a city of new beginnings. A city of young families making fresh starts, of university students becoming the next generation of professionals, of a community in constant renewal. The death of an infant in its midst is the precise opposite of everything the city represents. A beginning foreclosed before it could fully start, a future that will never be written. Rutherford County's law enforcement and prosecutors have pursued the case with the seriousness it demands. The grand jury did its work. The court system is doing its work. And the community of Murfreesboro carries, as it must, the weight of knowing that within its growing, dynamic, optimistic borders, a baby was lost in circumstances that the law has determined require a criminal accounting. Every baby deserves to live out their full story. If this case matters to you, leave a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. These stories need voices, and yours is one of them. Case 6. Brandi Elliott. The 23rd of March, 2023. Sumner County Criminal Court, Hendersonville, Tennessee. We return to Hendersonville. There is something particularly heavy about returning to a community for a second case, about the knowledge that a single city has had to absorb not one, but multiple incidents of this kind within the span of years. Hendersonville is not a large city. It is a suburban community of a few tens of thousands of people, church steeples visible from most major intersections, schools and youth sports programs, and all the infrastructure of a community invested in its children and their futures. People move to Hendersonville because it feels safe, because it is the kind of place where you know your neighbors and your children play together in yards and walk to school along streets that the community has chosen to call home. And yet, the first time we came to Hendersonville in this documentary, we came to speak of two newborn boys found lifeless in a laundry basket, killed by the mother who had hidden their existence for 9 months. Now we return, more than a decade later, to a different home, a different mother, a different child, and a different kind of violence. But the same city, the same community, the same question asked again. How? On the 23rd of March, 2023, emergency services were called to a home in Hendersonville. The call reported a child in distress, a child who was not breathing, a child who had been found submerged in water. First responders arrived and began their work with the urgency that the situation demanded. The child was 7 years old. She could not be revived. Brandi Elliott, the child's mother, was at the scene when officers arrived. The investigation that began in the immediate aftermath of the child's death moved with the deliberate thoroughness that law enforcement brings to the death of a child under circumstances that raise questions. The physical evidence of the scene, the account provided by the mother, the forensic examination of the child's body, and the circumstances of her death. All of it assembled into an evidentiary picture that led Sumner County investigators and prosecutors to a charging decision. Brandi Elliott was charged with first-degree murder. That charge, first-degree murder in the deliberate drowning of a 7-year-old child, is among the most serious that a Tennessee court can process. It carries with it the assumption, required by the legal standard of proof for that charge, that what happened to that little girl was not an accident, was not a moment of tragic inattention, was deliberate, was premeditated in the legal sense that the law demands for that classification. 7 years old is an age worth dwelling on. Not because the age of a victim determines the gravity of their loss. Every victim's life is equally irreplaceable, from the infant who has barely drawn breath to the elderly person at the end of a long life. But because 7 years old represents something specific about what was taken. A 7-year-old has memories, has relationships, has a world that extends beyond the home, school friends, a teacher whose name they know, a favorite book, a specific food they insist they hate, a fear of something ordinary, and a courage about something that surprises the adults around them. A 7-year-old is a complete person in a way that is already visible and already cherished by everyone who knows them. She had people in her life who knew her, teachers who had watched her navigate the social landscape of early elementary school, classmates who had eaten lunch beside her and played beside her at recess, neighbors who had seen her in the yard. Every one of those people was affected by her death. Every one of them was changed by the knowledge that she was gone. The Hendersonville community reacted with the grief and shock that the case deserved. For residents old enough to remember the Lindsay Lowe case, there was an added dimension of disbelief, the sense that a community should not have to absorb 2 cases of this kind within the span of a generation. That something about this place, or about the systems within it, needed to be examined. Brandi Elliott's case moved into the Sumner County court system. At the time of this documentary's preparation, the legal proceedings were ongoing. The charges she faces carry the potential for life imprisonment. The community waits for the process to conclude, not because any verdict will restore what was lost, but because accountability is what the law can provide, and the law is obligated to provide it. There are, in the geography of Sumner County, 2 graves that should not exist. 2 children taken before their time. 2 cases that will be attached to Hendersonville's identity for as long as the community endures. The only response available to a community in that position, the only response that honors both victims, is the commitment to do better, to look harder, to refuse to let the silence that preceded both tragedies settle again around families in distress. For the little girl who deserved to grow up in this community, please like, comment, and share this story. Don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. These children deserve witnesses. Case 7. Robin Rebecca Howington. The 28th of September, 2018. Knox County Criminal Court, Knoxville, Tennessee. Knoxville is the third largest city in Tennessee, and it is the city that East Tennessee calls its own. Situated along the Tennessee River at the point where the Valley and Ridge physiographic province meets the Cumberland Plateau, Knoxville has a topography that is inherently dramatic. Hills and hollows, the river making its great curves through the city, the Smoky Mountains visible on clear days from the elevated points of the landscape. A constant reminder that this is a city defined by its geography in ways that cities on flat plains can never quite experience. The University of Tennessee anchors Knoxville's identity as an educational and cultural center. The University Hospital, one of the region's major medical facilities, anchors its identity as a place of healthcare resources and medical expertise. The city has significant social services infrastructure, a network of community organizations, and the kind of institutional capacity that a mid-sized American city develops over generations. It is a city, in other words, that has the resources to care for its most vulnerable residents, has the systems in place, has the people trained to intervene. And yet, in the autumn of 2018, a child in Knox County died. Not from external violence, not from a stranger's malice, not from a medical condition that no one could have anticipated or prevented. She died from neglect, from the sustained and criminal failure of the one adult who was most responsible for her survival. Robin Rebecca Howington was charged with reckless homicide and aggravated child neglect in the death of her daughter, following an investigation that established, to the satisfaction of Knox County's prosecutors, that the child's death was the direct and foreseeable result of sustained neglect in the home. To understand what reckless homicide means in this context, it helps to understand what it means legally. Tennessee law defines reckless homicide as the reckless killing of another person, where reckless means that the person was aware of and consciously disregarded a substantial and unjustifiable risk that their conduct would result in death. Applied to child neglect, the charge says, you knew your child needed care. You knew the risk that failing to provide that care posed to your child's life. You made a conscious choice, not necessarily a choice to kill, but a choice to disregard the risk, and your child died as a result. Aggravated child neglect in Tennessee is reserved for the most severe cases, where the neglect results in serious bodily injury or death, or where it involves a child of particularly young age. The combination of reckless homicide and aggravated child neglect, brought together in a single case, tells the story of a child whose deterioration was both severe and sustained, not a brief lapse, not a moment of oversight, but a pattern of failure that accumulated over time until it became irreversible. The investigation that built the case against Robin Rebecca Howington was thorough. Knox County law enforcement worked with the medical examiner's office and with prosecutors to establish the timeline, the duration of the neglect, the degree of the child's deterioration, the point at which intervention could have saved her life, and the point at which it was too late. That timeline, assembled from physical evidence, medical records, and witness accounts, formed the foundation of the prosecution. Howington was convicted. She was sentenced by Knox County Criminal Court. The sentence reflected the court's determination that the death of this child was a criminal matter, that the failure of care documented in the evidence was not poverty, was not incapacity, was not the result of circumstances beyond Howington's control, but was the kind of sustained and conscious disregard for a child's welfare that the law is obligated to address. East Tennessee is a region with a fierce and genuine ethic of community, of looking out for one another, of showing up when someone needs help, of the kind of mutual care that Appalachian communities have practiced for generations because they understood, long before any policy framework articulated it, that survival depends on it. That ethic, applied to the welfare of children, means something specific. It means that when a child is in trouble, the community has an obligation to know about it and to act on what it knows. Somewhere in the network of people who moved through or adjacent to the Howington household, there may have been knowledge, partial, uncertain, troubling, that went unexamined or unreported. That is not a condemnation of any individual. It is a recognition that the gap between suspicion and action is one of the most consequential gaps in the entire architecture of child protection, and that closing it requires not just policy and training, but a cultural commitment to treating a child's welfare as a shared responsibility. Robin Rebecca Howington's daughter deserved that commitment. She deserved to be someone's urgent concern before it was too late. If this case stirred you, don't walk away from that feeling. Like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Awareness is not passive. It is the first step toward making sure the next child gets the intervention they need in time. Case 8. Brenda Dawn Behunin. Discovered in 2022. Sevier County Criminal Court, Sevierville, Tennessee. If you have ever stood at the edge of Gatlinburg and looked up at the mountains that rise behind the town, at the ridgelines that carry the name Great Smoky, named for the blue haze that the forest exhales into the morning air, you understand something about Sevier County that no amount of words fully captures. This is one of the most beautiful places in North America. The national park that covers much of the county's southern expanse is visited by more people each year than almost any other unit of the national park system. The mountains are ancient, among the oldest on Earth, and they carry that age in their rounded profiles, worn smooth by hundreds of millions of years of weather and erosion into shapes that feel, somehow, both wild and familiar. People come to Sevier County from everywhere. They rent cabins in the hills above Pigeon Forge. They walk the trails above Gatlinburg in the early morning when the mist is still in the valleys. They eat at the pancake restaurants and browse the souvenir shops and take their children to the attractions that line the parkway. Then they leave, carrying the memory of the mountains, the smell of the forest, the particular quality of light on a smoky mountain afternoon, back to wherever they came from. But some people stay. Or rather, some people live here, not as visitors, but as residents, in the neighborhoods and rural roads and small communities that make up the lived reality of a county whose public face is almost entirely oriented toward tourism. The people who work the hotels and restaurants and attractions. The people who grew up here and who remain here. The people whose lives are the ordinary texture of a place that other people visit as an escape. And among those residents, in 2022, a 3-year-old boy died. His mother, Brenda Dawn Behunin, was indicted on charges of murder and neglect in connection with his death. 3 years old. In the shadow of some of the most beautiful mountains on the continent, a 3-year-old child's life was cut short in circumstances serious enough for a grand jury to bring the most serious charges available under Tennessee law. A 3-year-old child occupies a very specific developmental moment, one that is, in many ways, the most purely human of any stage of life. The 3-year-old is old enough to have language, to have preferences, to have a recognizable personality. Old enough to ask why about everything, to be ferociously attached to certain objects and inexplicably resistant to others, to have developed the beginning of a theory about how the world works, but still entirely dependent, in every practical sense, on the adults responsible for their care, unable to seek food independently in any meaningful way, unable to access medical care, unable to leave, unable to do anything except exist within the environment that their caregiver has created for them. When the circumstances of a 3-year-old's death lead a grand jury to return a murder indictment, the implicit narrative encoded in that legal action is grim. It is the narrative of a child who needed things and did not receive them, who needed protection and did not receive it, who existed within the care, or the catastrophic failure of care, of an adult who bore legal and moral responsibility for ensuring that a 3-year-old who could not help themselves was helped. The indictment against Brenda Dawn Behunin moved the case into Sevier County Criminal Court. The details of the investigation, the specific findings that led to the murder charge, the nature of the neglect alleged, the timeline of events, became part of the evidentiary record that the court would examine. The community of Sevier County, more accustomed to processing the logistics of tourism than the weight of a criminal case of this kind, found itself confronted with the knowledge that the beauty of its landscape is not a shield against the darkness that can exist in any human household. that the mountains visible from every point in the county are indifferent to what happens in the valleys below, that the protection of the most vulnerable residents of any community is not guaranteed by geography or by the picturesque character of the place where they were born. The 3-year-old at the center of this case had a short life. He saw those mountains, or perhaps he did not, depending on the circumstances of his confinement. He knew the small world of his home. He knew the faces above him. He was entirely at the mercy of the adults around him. And he deserved, with every fiber of his 3-year-old existence, to be kept safe. The courts of Sevier County were asked to determine whether that failure of safety rose to the level of murder. That determination was in process at the time of this documentary's preparation. A 3-year-old boy deserved so much more than what he got. Leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Let your voice be a witness for the children who have none. Case 9. Patricia Sylvester. The 21st of November, 2022. Bedford County Criminal Court, Shelbyville, Tennessee. There is a particular cruelty in the death of a child who is old enough to know what is coming. An infant has no capacity to anticipate. A toddler has limited cognitive access to the concept of danger. But a 12-year-old is different. A 12-year-old understands the world with a sophistication that, while still developing, is already capable of grasping threat, of feeling fear in its full emotional dimension, of experiencing the specific horror of recognizing danger in the place where safety was promised. That is the dimension of the case of Patricia Sylvester that is hardest to sit with. Not just that a 12-year-old boy died, but that he was old enough to have understood, in his final moments, what was happening to him. Old enough to have hoped, perhaps, that someone would come. Old enough, in the worst and most agonizing sense, to have known that no one was coming. Bedford County, Tennessee. Home to Shelbyville, the county seat that sits in the rolling agricultural landscape of the Central Tennessee Plateau, a place known for the Tennessee walking horse and for the kind of deep-rooted community identity that agricultural counties in this part of the South tend to develop over generations, was confronted on the 21st of November, 2022, with a case that pushed the boundaries of what a community thinks it knows about the safety of children within families. On that November day, law enforcement responded to the Sylvester home. What they found was a 12-year-old boy who was dead and a 4-year-old child who had survived. Patricia Sylvester, the mother of both children, was taken into custody. The charges filed against her reflected the totality of what investigators believed had occurred. She was charged with killing her 12-year-old son, with murder in its most intentional form, and with the attempted killing of her 4-year-old child. 2 acts of violence, one completed and one interrupted. One child who did not survive and one child who, by some combination of circumstance and whatever intervention occurred, managed to live. That surviving 4-year-old is, in their own way, a victim of unimaginable weight. They were present in the home on that November day. They experienced, in whatever way a 4-year-old's cognition experiences such things, the events that unfolded. They survived to carry that experience forward, into whatever care they were subsequently placed in, into whatever life they will eventually build. The particular burden of being the child who survived when a sibling did not is one that mental health professionals understand as a complex and lasting kind of trauma. That burden now belongs to a 4-year-old who had no part in creating the circumstances that produced it. The investigation that followed the events of November 21st, 2022, was thorough and detailed. Bedford County law enforcement and prosecutors built a case designed to establish, beyond reasonable doubt, the elements of first-degree murder in the death of the 12-year-old and the elements of attempted murder in connection with the 4-year-old's survival. The case raised questions, as cases of this kind always do, about the household in the period before the violence occurred, about whether there had been warning signs, moments of visible distress, of escalating danger, of the kind of indicators that professionals and community members are trained to recognize, about what support systems, if any, the family had access to, about what institutions and individuals had been in contact with the family and what, if anything, they had observed. Those questions are not asked as deflection from Patricia Sylvester's individual responsibility. They are asked because the full accounting of any tragedy requires understanding the full context in which it occurred, not to distribute blame across a wider surface area, but to identify the points at which different choices, by different actors, might have produced a different outcome. A 12-year-old boy in Bedford County, Tennessee, is dead. He will not see the Tennessee walking horses that are the emblem of his county. He will not grow into the person he was becoming. He will not have the adolescence that was, as of November 20th, 2022, still ahead of him. Patricia Sylvester's case continued its progress through the Bedford County court system. The charges carry the most severe penalties Tennessee law provides. The community of Shelbyville, shaped by generations of agricultural life and the deep roots of Middle Tennessee culture, found itself called upon to exercise the same steadiness in the face of this case that the land itself embodies, to process the grief and the anger, to bear witness, and to commit, once again, to the protection of the most vulnerable. For the 12-year-old boy who deserved every year ahead of him, please like, comment, and don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. His story deserves to be heard. Case 10. Soniemy Benitez Melendez. The 7th of August, 2023. Blount County Criminal Court, Maryville, Tennessee. The last case in this documentary brings us to Blount County, to the city of Maryville, which sits in a geographic position of extraordinary significance in the East Tennessee landscape. To the south and southeast, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park fills the horizon with ridgeline after ridgeline disappearing into the distance. To the north, the Knox County metropolitan area, Knoxville and its suburbs, extends in the other direction. Maryville exists at the meeting point of wildness and civilization, of mountain grandeur and suburban development, of a community with deep Appalachian roots and a modern infrastructure shaped by healthcare, education, and the economic activity of a county that has grown steadily in the orbit of Knoxville's expansion. It is a place where families choose to live because it combines the accessibility of the metro area with the proximity of the natural world, the sense that you are never too far from clean air and open landscape, from the trails that wind up into the mountains where the air smells of balsam and the distant sounds of the park replace the sounds of the highway. On the 7th of August, 2023, a 7-month-old baby girl was in a home in Blount County, and she was in the care of her mother. Her mother's name was Soniemy Benitez Melendez. At 7 months old, a baby is in one of the most vulnerable and one of the most miraculous phases of early human development. Vulnerable because they are utterly dependent, unable to feed themselves, unable to move themselves out of danger, unable to communicate distress in any language more specific than crying. Miraculous because they are beginning, in this phase, to become recognizably themselves, to respond to faces with growing specificity, to reach deliberately for objects, to laugh at things that strike them as funny in whatever way a 7-month-old experiences humor. 7 months old is the age of first clear signs of personality, of the baby looking at the world with eyes that are becoming increasingly focused and increasingly curious. She was beginning to know the world. She did not get to finish knowing it. Soniemy Benitez Melendez called emergency services to report that her baby was not breathing. Responders arrived. The baby was transported to a medical facility. She could not be saved. The 7-month-old was dead. The investigation that followed the infant's death was conducted with the seriousness and care that every infant death demands and receives from Tennessee law enforcement. A forensic autopsy was performed by the medical examiner's office, a comprehensive examination designed to establish, with scientific precision, both the cause and manner of death. In cases where the cause of an infant's death is unclear, the autopsy is the primary instrument through which the medical and legal truth is established. The autopsy findings in this case were unambiguous. The cause of death was suffocation. The manner of death was homicide. Those two findings, cause and manner, changed everything. They transformed a tragedy into a crime scene. They transformed a grieving mother into a suspect. They transformed a medical emergency into a murder investigation. Soniemy Benitez Melendez was charged with criminal homicide. Criminal homicide in Tennessee is the umbrella charge under which various levels of unlawful killing are prosecuted, from first-degree premeditated murder down through lesser degrees, depending on what the evidence establishes about intent, premeditation, and the specific circumstances of the act. In the context of an infant death determined to have resulted from suffocation, the charge of criminal homicide initiates the process through which the precise degree of criminal responsibility will be established. The investigation that followed the charging decision was multifaceted and thorough. Blount County law enforcement worked in coordination with the state medical examiner's office, with forensic specialists, and with prosecutors to assemble the evidentiary case. The details that emerged, the forensic findings, the timeline of events on the day of the baby's death, the physical circumstances of the home, and the information gathered from investigation of the household, formed the foundation of the prosecution. The case attracted significant attention in Blount County and throughout East Tennessee. The death of an infant determined to be a homicide is, in any community, a matter of the deepest public concern. The charge brought against the mother focused that concern into something more specific, a legal process, moving deliberately forward, designed to establish the truth and provide accountability. Advocacy organizations for victims of family violence, professionals in child protective services, pediatric medical professionals, and community members all turned their attention to the question that every such case raises in its wake. What more could be done? What systems need strengthening? What training needs improving? What networks of community support need to be built or expanded so that the next infant at risk has a better chance of being identified and protected? Those questions do not have easy answers, and they are not asked to suggest that the failures of any system diminish the individual responsibility of those charged with crimes. They are asked because the commitment to preventing future tragedies requires understanding the full landscape in which current tragedies occur, the social and economic conditions, the gaps in support systems, the cultural factors, the institutional limitations that collectively determine how much protection vulnerable children actually receive versus how much protection the system theoretically provides. In Blount County, Tennessee, in the shadow of the Great Smoky Mountains, a 7-month-old baby girl died on the 7th of August, 2023. She had been in the world for 7 months. She had begun to recognize faces and to laugh at things that struck her as funny. She had begun the journey of becoming herself, a journey that required decades to complete and that she would never get to finish. She deserved those decades. She deserved to grow up in the shadow of those mountains, to learn their names, to walk their trails someday, to carry in her body the particular physical memory of the landscape where she was born. She deserved everything. Soniemy Benitez Melendez was awaiting the progression of her case through the Blount County court system at the time of this documentary's preparation. The legal process is ongoing. The wheels of justice move with the deliberate care that the law requires, and that the gravity of the charge demands. Whatever the legal outcome, the truth at the center of this case is already established by the medical examiner's findings. A baby girl was suffocated. Her death was a homicide, and the law of Blount County, Tennessee, is determined to provide an accounting. We have examined 10 cases here in Tennessee, 10 stories that span different years, different counties, and different circumstances, yet are bound together by one unthinkable reality. 10 cases, 10 women, 10 Tennessee communities that have been forced to carry the weight of losses that no community should ever have to carry. We have traveled far in this documentary, geographically, emotionally, and in terms of the sheer range of human experience it has required us to examine. We began on the streets of Memphis, where 4 sisters died on a Father's Day afternoon, and a city was left to grieve in a way that does not resolve quickly or neatly. We moved through the suburbs of Nashville's orbit, where 2 unnamed boys and a 7-year-old girl and a mother's unthinkable choices added Hendersonville to the geography of this story twice over. We stood in Clarksville where a teenager starved, in Murfreesboro where an infant was lost, in Knoxville where a daughter was neglected to death, in Sevierville where a 3-year-old disappeared in the shadow of the most visited mountains in America, in Shelbyville where a 12-year-old boy was killed and a 4-year-old narrowly survived, and in Maryville where a 7-month-old baby drew her last breath in August heat. Each of these places is a real community. Each of the people in these case files is a real person. And each of the children at the center of these cases was a real human being, complete, irreplaceable, possessed of a life that had value not because of what they accomplished or what they contributed or what they might someday have become, but simply because they were alive. That is the foundational principle from which everything in this documentary proceeds. The children in these cases had value. Their deaths were losses, not statistical losses, not abstract losses, but the specific, concrete, individual loss of a specific person whose absence creates a hole in the world that nothing else can fill. This documentary has been careful, throughout, to make the distinctions that honesty and fairness require, between conviction and indictment, between what has been legally established and what remains before the courts, between the full weight of established guilt and the presumption of innocence that the law requires for those still awaiting trial. Those distinctions matter. They are not procedural formalities. They are the expression of values about how a just society treats its accused, even when the accusations are grave and the evidence is compelling. But the documentary has also been clear about what is not in dispute. Children died. Children were harmed. The losses are real regardless of the final legal disposition of every case. The grief of every community represented in these pages is real, and the obligation to speak these truths, to name these victims, and to carry their stories forward is not diminished by the complexities of the legal process. Let us say their names again, not as a formality, but as an act of witness. Sia Gardner, 10 years old, Memphis. Shanynthia Gardner, 7 years old, Memphis. Sutton Gardner, 4 years old, Memphis. Sierra Gardner, 1 year old, Memphis. Baby boy Lowe, newborn twins, Hendersonville. The teenager of Clarksville, whose name has been protected, but whose suffering was real and whose life mattered. Evelyn Mae Boswell, 15 months old, Sullivan County. The infant of Murfreesboro, whose name has been withheld from public record, but who existed and who deserved to live. The 7-year-old girl of Hendersonville, whose life was connected to teachers and classmates and neighbors who grieve her. The daughter of Knox County, who needed care and did not receive it. The 3-year-old son of Sevier County, who lived and died in the shadow of some of the most beautiful mountains on earth. The 12-year-old boy of Shelbyville, who was old enough to understand and who deserved so much more than what he got. And the 7-month-old baby girl of Blount County, who had only 7 months and who was just beginning to know the world. Every name on that list, spoken or withheld, known to the public or protected by the privacy considerations that the law extends to the youngest and most vulnerable victims, represents a complete human being. A person who had a beginning and who was denied a middle and an end. A person whose absence creates a specific and particular grief in the people who knew them, and a broader and more diffuse grief in the communities that held them. True crime, at its best and most serious, is not entertainment. We say that clearly and without apology. The cases in this documentary are not here because they are exciting or dramatic or satisfying in the way that fictional crime narratives can be. They are here because they are true, because they happened, because the children in them deserve to be witnessed, to have their stories told with accuracy and care and the full weight of moral seriousness that they warrant, and because awareness has practical consequences. The most important contribution that any true crime documentary can make is not to the closure of individual cases. Investigators and prosecutors and courts handle that work, and they handle it with skill and dedication. The most important contribution is to the broader public understanding of how these tragedies occur, what they look like in the period before they become tragedies, and what any individual member of a community can do when they see something that concerns them. Children who die from neglect do not, in most cases, deteriorate invisibly. Someone usually saw something. A teacher who noticed that a child came to school hungry, repeatedly. A neighbor who heard things, or who stopped hearing a child who had previously been audible in the yard. A family member who visited and felt something was wrong and did not know what to do with that feeling. A doctor who treated a child and documented findings that, in retrospect, told a story. The gap between observation and action, the gap between noticing and reporting, between concern and intervention, is one of the most consequential gaps in the entire architecture of child protection in this country. It is a gap created by uncertainty, by the fear of being wrong, by the discomfort of becoming involved in someone else's family dynamics, by a cultural habit of minding one's own business that serves well in many contexts and catastrophically badly in this one. Closing that gap requires something that no policy can mandate and no law can enforce. It requires a cultural shift, a collective decision, made community by community and person by person, to treat a child's welfare as everyone's business. To decide that the discomfort of being wrong about a concern is categorically less important than the possibility of being right. To build communities in which children are genuinely, actively, collectively protected, not just in theory and not just in the moments when harm is already done, but in the ongoing, daily practice of paying attention to the children around us and acting on what we observe. Tennessee's courts have done their part. Law enforcement has done its part. Prosecutors have done their part. The question is what the rest of us do, in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our families, in our churches and community organizations and workplaces, to ensure that the children in our orbit are seen, are known, and are safe. The 10 cases in this documentary are not the last of their kind. More cases will emerge. More children will be placed in danger. The work of protecting them will not end with a verdict in any single courtroom. It is ongoing, permanent, and shared. This is True Crime Silent Files. We do not look away. We do not let the silence settle. We do not accept the comfortable fiction that tragedies like these are aberrations too rare and too extreme to concern us. They are not aberrations. They are the extreme end of a continuum that begins with the failures of support and attention and community that allow harm to grow unseen. And they are preventable, not always, not perfectly, but often enough that the effort is demanded of us. If the children in this documentary stayed with you, if their faces, seen or unseen, real or imagined from the details of their lives, remained in your mind after you finished reading, then carry them forward. Say their names. Share their stories. Support the organizations in your community that work every day in unglamorous and underfunded ways to protect children from the harms that are most likely to reach them. And subscribe to True Crime Silent Files, because there are always more stories. Always more children who need witnesses. Always more cases in which the truth, carefully told, can serve the justice that the law provides and the memory that the victims deserve. We are here. We are paying attention. We do not let silence win. Thank you for watching True Crime Silent Files, because every victim deserves a voice. Like, comment, subscribe, say their names. Don't let silence win.